Thank you, Austis, and a very warm welcome to all of you in the EFTA house, and of course also all of you online. So I am the director of the Internal Market Division in EFTA. We are, and we like to call ourselves as the heart of the EEA agreement, not only because the people who work there are fantastic, warm and engaged, which I'm happy to share every day working life with, but also because literally this is where the EU legislation is pumped into our system and we pump it out to our member states. I will try to give you a bit of a glimpse of what we do and the role of the Secretariat in this respect. There should be some time in the end for some questions, but don't hesitate to raise a hand if something is unclear. Okay. So our Secretary General was mentioning this a bit, but EFTA is then a European Free Trade Association. It's an intergovernmental organization for the promotion of free trade and economic integration between our states and between our member states and the rest of the world. And now we have Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland. And they do EFTA, and as you might be aware of, Switzerland is not a part of the EEA agreement. So when we talk about the EEA process, it's the remaining 3 countries. EFTA is responsible for managing the EFTA Convention, which established EFTA in 1960. Maybe the biggest work of what we do is the amount of, sort of when it comes to amount, it's the running and management of the EFTA agreement, which we do here in Brussels. Our headquarters is in Geneva, and there is also where we take care of our worldwide network of free trade agreements that you heard a bit about earlier. Not to forget, we also have a statistic office situated in Liechtenstein, in Luxembourg, which is also very important because of any of you who know the development of our societies, we need to base that on facts and figures. So it's very useful for our members to be a part of that. So the Secretariat in Brussels, what do we do here? Well, we are assisting our member states, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, in the so-called EEA process. Meaning all the way from you start in the EU by thinking of new legislation till it is incorporated into the EEA agreement as an international binding decision. We are also having a coordinating role between our 3 member states and the EU side, the European Commission. And we are also the Secretariat of EEA advisory bodies. They are the parliamentary committee where our parliamentarians from our capitals and parliaments are meeting both amongst each other, but also having for meeting EU colleagues in joint meetings. And there are these, oh, now I forgot the name. Give me the other advisory body. Sorry? Yeah, the consultative bodies, which are the social partners. Yes. And I would like to start with this, the objectives and principles of the agreement, not only because this gives us a vision of what this is all about, but I think in reality, this shapes really everyday work of the Secretariat. So the agreement was establishing a dynamic and homogeneous European economical area based on common rules and equal conditions for competition and providing for the adequate means of enforcement at the judicial and at the judicial level. The latter 2 is ESA, which you will hear a bit about from later, but also the EFTA court in Luxembourg. The agreement extends the internal market to the participating EEA states, and it's incorporation of all relevant legislation that we have already obliged ourselves to do, is the dynamic aspect of the agreement. And then, as I mentioned, the setup for making it homogeneous. And then what is it all about? What is the scope? Well, the substantive scope is this. The 4 freedoms, free movement of goods, services, capitals, and persons. These are supported by 3 very important areas. on state aid, competition, and public procurement to ensure that the activities of businesses and governments are not, or public bodies are not hampering the free movement. In addition, there are some horizontal policies, and I have made some examples of them here. That are not linked to one of the freedoms, but goes all over. Environmental is an obvious one, and very, very, of course, something that we hear about every day these days. Social policy is another important aspect. We need to have the whole of the society along if this is going to work. Consumer protection. We need to enable the consumers also to take part of the internal market at their best. Statistics I mentioned. Company law is another example. We are also cooperating in EU programs. Our member states have the privilege somehow to choose which of the EU programs they can take part of, and our member states are contributing according to that. Finally, we have the cohesion and EEA and Norway grants, where our member states are contributing to the cohesion throughout Europe. This is actually my favorite slide, because this says something about what is the agreement trying to do, and not to mention, again, what we are trying to do in the EFTA House with the cooperation of our member states every single day. When they made it, the agreement, it was important to reconcile two quite different models of cooperation. On the EU side, there is supranationality, transfer of competence and sovereignty from member states, institutions with defined roles in the decision-making or legal lawmaking process, the Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council of the member states. And an important concern for the EU is to preserve the decision-making autonomy of the EU. On our side, on the EFTA side, we have intergovernmental cooperation. We have no transfer of competence and we don't take part of the common policies. It doesn't mean that we cannot cooperate on this outside the agreement, but the EEA agreement doesn't handle that. Decisions are taken by consensus. Our 3 member states have to be ready, and they have to be agree to take legal acts into the EEA agreement. And we also have to agree with the EU to do the same. And as you might be aware of, the important concern for our member states is then the agreement is to preserve our member states' sovereignty. So this is in every writing we do to fit the EU law into the EEA agreement. These two challenges, all these challenges we have to face. For doing so, we have a framework, the so-called 2-pillar structure. On one side, on the left side, you have the EFTA pillar. On the right side, you have the EU pillar. In the middle, the blue boxes are where our 2 parties, let's say, meet and either discuss or make decisions. The EEA Council is the governing body, highest governing body of the EEA cooperation, where our foreign ministers are meeting the EU Council presidency and the Secretariat General of the Commission. The Standing Committee is where our EU ambassadors meet. And as our Secretary just said, Norway is holding the chairmanship at the moment. And they meet in the joint committee, they meet with the Commission. So, a bit further into the EEA process, what do we do? What's the framework of making EU law, EEA law, and how can we participate? Just some numbers first. When we entered into the EEA agreement, 1,875 acts were put into that package. When we signed it the agreement in 1992, 14,000 acts have today been incorporated or around that, since the signing, which is quite substantive. Out of them, we guess, we don't have the exact numbers, around 6,000 acts are enforced today. Food and veterinary area is the most important area, or in the biggest area, having something like 35 to 40% of all the legal acts incorporated. It means that we have full compliance with the EU rules in the food chains, and we have frictionless export and no veterinary imports or export controls, which is quite important when we want the food to reach its customers and dinner tables all over Europe as soon as possible. Other high volume areas are transport, a lot of legislation, of course, on anything from the air to the sea. Financial services, important. I mean, especially maybe after financial crisis, the EU has produced a lot. And finally, also a high level of acts in the area of goods, where we have technical regulations to facilitate the free movement of goods. We have two main strains in the EEA work. One part is the decision shaping, where we participate in the development of the EU legislation and before the EU adoption. I will say a little bit on that. And the decision making is where we incorporate the already adopted EU law into the EEA agreement, and that my dear colleague Finnur will say a bit about later. So this might seem a bit confusing, but it's not so bad if we just split it up. If you look at the right side, that's the EU decision-making process. The first part of it, expert groups. Our member states have the right within following the EEA agreement to be consulted and in the same way as member states. This means that we can actually participate in these groups. It means that our representatives and delegates from capitals, ministries, would meet here in the Commission expert groups and discuss development and also new thoughts on legislation. It is very important that we are there, because this is where we can pick up what's going on at an early stage and contribute. Then the Commission makes a proposal, and at that very moment, it is sent over to the Council and the European Parliament. From then on, our member states do not have any, thank you, any formal role anymore. But that doesn't mean that we cannot participate informally, which we also do, mainly done by our missions, because they are the ones who do policy. We just do the facts and do what they tell us to do, because they are the ones giving us the mandates. But we do have something called the EFTA Commons. That is common positions papers where our member states have agreed on a position to a legal act. It could be even a sentence in a paragraph or whatever. But anyway, that's how we can participate. Then finally, when we get here that you have an adoption by the Parliament and the Council, that's when the formal procedure of the EEA process starts. That's when our register in the 5th floor in this building every morning looks through the official journal of the European of the EU and looks through other sources of information to find out what has been adopted on the EU side. And then we start our work here. You saw this one earlier, and in the box here is behind there is where the EEA work takes place. As I keep saying, our ambassadors are wonderful, clever, and have a lot of knowledge of EU matters, but they are not, of course, doing the nitty-gritty works. With the process, sometimes it takes many years, sometimes it just takes, I think our record is 3 days, and you can maybe guess that that had something to do with COVID, when we had to process legislation really, really fast. But it means that this is not something for them, so there is a process or a setup behind that to help. 4 subcommittees, here our Ministry of Foreign Affairs are meeting to assist the Standing Committee of the Ambassadors. Under that, we have all the EFTA working groups that are mainly meeting in this house to discuss new legislation. So when our registrar has sent it, has registered it, it goes out here, and then we have the back and forth with the capitals to assess the agreement and so on, which Finnur will tell you a bit more about later. So then that's when the decision making starts. But then I just wanted also to highlight some numbers for you, because what are all these legal acts? And we always hear, I said 16,000 earlier, but what is it exactly? This says something about both how many legal acts we process every year, but it also says something about the legal acts that are waiting for the incorporation. Because as you understand, since we don't start before the moment the EU is done, we will already be late. So as you see here, the green ones are the legal acts adopted by EU every year. The dark blue one is how many it was adopted through a joint decision in the EU EEA Joint Committee. And the light blue ones are those that we have looked at but are considered not to be within the scope of the agreement. And as you see, the last 2 years, we are doing not too bad if you think of how many legal acts are coming from the EU. And we know that some of them are big and complex. So even if it looks quite okay there, we have a backlog of about 600 and something, which fluctuates a bit on and off. I think what you see, this is how many acts we are sort of waiting incorporation where they already the deadline is, or it's already in force on the EU side. So what about the EU today and the EEA in today's Europe? Well, first of all, there is no doubt, and this is also what not only we say, but what we hear from our dear friends in the EU side, the EU agreement remains robust, resilient, and we are actually soon entering into to celebrating its 30 years of existence. But that doesn't mean that there are challenges. On the EU side, there has been big changes. They have changed their constitution, and the EEA agreement is mainly circulating around the internal market. But it doesn't mean that we are not able to find solutions. But what we see, though, which makes it more challenging, and maybe also as again the Secretariat was saying in the beginning, why it is so important to understand the EEA work, is that it is getting more complex. The EU is producing, of course, legal acts to and regulate according because of finding their own solutions to things. They don't think about the framework of the agreement. So we do find legal acts that are both inside and outside the agreement. One thing that was not catered for in the EEA agreement are the agencies, and we know that the last decade, you know, the EEA have really popped up agencies all over on important areas where also our countries have challenges. So very often we find that our member states want to take part in that agency. But since the EEA agreement doesn't cater for that, we have to find solutions. We have to transfer competence to ESA instead of to the agency, for instance, and we have to find ways for our member states to participate. This takes time, and it takes longer to incorporate the legal acts. Legal acts are also linked. From maybe one area, you can do something on financial services, but it doesn't help because you're waiting for something on energy, for instance. So also EU and EEA law have different scope. We are now facing a time where the Commission is producing legal acts with a touch of trade policy, which is outside the agreement. Industrial policy, I said earlier that we are not a part of the common policies of the EU. How do we solve that when we see that the foundation of these legal regulations are internal market regulation, but it also regulates more, not to mention Customs Act is used for solving problems or for having market surveillance. We are not a part of the customs union. So yeah, in general, as I said, in nature, we are late, and this adds on to the so-called backlog. And why is that bad? Well, it is bad because that hampers the well-functioning of the internal market. It means that our citizens, you guys, and our businesses, and also our governments are not able to take the advantages of the freedoms of the internal market because our countries have not incorporated, or we haven't incorporated those acts into the agreement. Yeah, and of course we have big challenges in the world today, not only crisis management as as the war and earlier the pandemic, but we have an important flagship in EU, which our country is also struggling with, the European Green Deal. There is the digital decade in Europe, and both those two flagships are sort of followed up with massive amounts of legal acts. We are in-house talking about the tsunami that we are waiting for. So all these things makes it challenging because we have to fit it into the EEA agreement. We, of course, can also work in both inside and outside the agreement, but we need to find these solutions. So again, this is one of the reasons why we continue to have this seminar and why we continue to reach out, because to make the agreement work, it's essential that anyone who is working with it, both on our side in Brussels, our partners on the EU side, but also in our member states, understand how this works. Only by doing so, we can make it work and take advantage of what the agreement is meant to be. That was the crash course. So I'm very happy to take any questions.